Alex, good to have you here. I'm very excited to read your new book, Grow the Pie. You're in London today, right? So this is it's morning your time. Thanks a lot for your time. So before we start, let me just very briefly introduce this book to our audience and about yourself, because this is all platform live stream. So some of the audiences in China might not be very familiar with you. So together with me today to talk about this book, Grow the Pie, is Professor Alex Edmans joining us from London. And let me just read introduction about him to you. I'm literally just copying it from Wikipedia. I don't know if it's accurate or not, but I'm sure most of them is accurate. So Professor Alex Edmans is a professor of finance at London Business School and the current Mercer School of Memorial Professor of Business at Grantham College. Since 2017, he has been the managing editor of the Review of Finance, which is a leading academic finance journal in Europe. Also, he is a regular speaker at TED. And also, in 2021, he was named the Professor of the Year by Poets and Quants. So that is Professor Alex Edmans. So his new book, Grow the Pie, in Chinese is called 蛋糕经济学. So basically, the literal translation translate the pie to be cake. They're more or less the same thing. I find it's a very timely discussion for two reasons. First of all, this book is more or less, is mostly associated with ESG and how can ESG investment by a company can grow the pie bigger and then be more beneficial to the society and the company. And then secondly, very importantly, is we do have this discussion on we want to share the cake and we want to, bridge the inequality within our society nowadays. But before we want to share the cake and we want to bridge the inequality, probably one thing is very important is that we want to make the cake as big as possible. But how to do that? So I think this is why this book is very important. The English version of this book was named as one of the best business book in 2020 by Financial Times, and its Chinese version is going to be on the market very soon. So today we are very happy to have Alex with us. So Alex, why don't you just give us a brief background about why you want to write this very interesting book?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be here on World Book Day. So why did I write this book? Is that ESG and purpose, this is a very big topic nowadays. But it's also quite controversial because people think, well, if a company is responsible, then it's not going to be delivering profits. And it's really important for a company to be profitable because then shareholders will be able to get a return. So we often think that profits and purpose is an either or choice, right? If a company is more responsible, that is at the expense of profit. So this is what I call the fixed pie mentality or the fixed cake mentality. So that assumes the value that a company creates as a cake, and it can be given either to shareholders or to society. But what I wanted to highlight in the book, and this is why it's called cake economics, is that when a company is responsible, it is not splitting the cake differently. It's growing the cake, so not only is society benefiting, but also shareholders are benefiting as well. So it's not just good for society, it's good business sense.
Right. That's actually very important. I noticed in your book you did say that it took you about 4 years, to verify a certain conclusion of the book. Why it took so long?
Because it's really important to distinguish between correlation and causation. So if people say responsible companies do better, everybody will latch onto it and believe it, but because we're biased, right, we believe what we would like to be true. One might think it could be the opposite. Once a company is profitable, then it can be more responsible. So it might be profit that leads to purpose rather than purpose leading to profit. So I need to be really rigorous and show that it is actually purpose that leads to profit and not the other way around. So my book is not just based on wishful thinking, but on rigorous evidence. And I think that's important because if I talk about the idea of win-wins, where everybody can make the cake bigger, they might think, well, that sounds great, but it's too good to be true. So I want to show it's buttressed by evidence.
I think data is extremely important, and I did see a lot of very persuasive data in your book, which are very important in terms of providing evidence and being persuasive to all the senior managements nowadays on the street. But before we start kicking into all the details of the book, can you tell us why pie growing mentality is so new, so to speak? Because in economics, we do have this sentiment sentence, we do have this term called increasing return. Isn't increasing return and pie growing more or less the same thing? So is this the new idea, or it is only new because it's under ESG concept or context?
So I do think it is new, because if you think about typical economic theory, right? So when you think about how does a company maximize profits, you maximize profits by minimizing wages, minimizing costs, and so on. And if you think about some of the most successful management innovations, those have been ways to reduce your costs. So the assembly line, for example, that was a way of forcing workers to keep up with the pace of production to make sure that they're not slacking. So often we think a great boss is one who makes sure she gets as much out of her workers as possible. So what I wanted to show is actually we have a win-win game. So there are ways of serving society which are also profitable for business. And so that was the radical new idea of the book.
Right. I think that is absolutely very clear and very important. But do you think all the founders and the business leaders on the street, they're buying this idea? Because, most of them are thinking that they're thinking investing into ESG or just throwing extra money probably is not going to generate any extra return for them. So how to make sure that they are persuaded so they can all adopt this ESG investment to make the pie bigger?
You're absolutely right, Kate. So many people are skeptical. So they think, well, ESG, that's just something which is a distraction from the bottom line. So any serious business person, we don't want to genuinely do it. So I think the best way to persuade it is with rigorous evidence. And so this is why I come to the question as a professor of finance. So I'm not a professor of ethics or philosophy. I'm a finance person. When I was working, I was an investment banker at Morgan Stanley. So I understand the importance of profit. But even a hard-hearted person like me, who's just about finance and numbers, recognizes that actually purpose is a way of making a company more profitable. So I think the best way to persuade people is not with a guilt-tripping argument, but with the data. And so this is why the book is data-driven. But I also want to stress that it also puts a lot of practical examples of how to become a purposeful company. So it's not just statistics. The statistics are a starting point, but really the framework for how to put it in practice is what I think is really powerful.
Right, so before we get into the frameworks, which are very important by you, your conclusion is that you, through 4 years' time, you found that 100 best companies to work for in America delivered stock returns that beat their peers by an average of 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period. That's about 89% to 184% cumulative. So you took 4 years to verify this robustness. This is actually very, very important. Let's go to the framework introduced by you under these numbers and can support these numbers. Please just briefly tell us.
Yeah, absolutely. Because when people think about responsibility and purpose, they might take it to the other extreme. They will say, well, we should do everything we can to serve society. We need to help customers and employees and the environment and give loads of money to charity. But that's not true either, because if you're trying to be all things to all people, you're forgetting profits. So what my book tries to be is realistic and sort of middle of the road. Yes, we do need to be responsible, but we can't be all things to all people. We need to be focused and targeted. So what I highlight in the book is how do we know what we should be doing in order to serve society? So one principle I introduce is called comparative advantage. We should only serve society in things which are linked to our expertise. So I go through the example of Vodafone, the UK telecoms company. They launched M-Pesa, a mobile money service in Kenya, which lifted 200,000 people out of poverty. And why did they do that? That was using their expertise of telecoms. The second idea I highlight is one called materiality, which is we want to highlight the most material stakeholders for us. For example, everybody thinks that climate change is really important, and it is. But if you're in the tech industry, maybe the environment is not the most material factor for you. It might be certain things like customer privacy, data security, misinformation, and so forth. So the big thing here is that if you want to be responsible, we don't have to solve every single one of the world's problems, but focus on the 3 or 4 that we're uniquely well placed to solve.
Right. I think these 3 frameworks are very helpful, and they're very succinct. So you can put all these evidences and all your daily work into these three frameworks and try to measure them. Talking about measurement, you talk about that you're a finance person, so data and quantitative measurement is very important. Also, social performance is also very important. These are probably 2 important metrics to guide this ESG investment going and to make this pie bigger. But can you just go deeper into this financial financial performance measurement. How should we actually qualify it in detail? It took you about 4 years to get all those numbers. We certainly do not want to take that long for any single company and senior management to make their decision. So how can get it easier in terms of financial performance measurement?
Yeah, absolutely. So measuring whether a company is responsible is really critical. So what we have now, which is the positive sign, is there's many more data sets about a company's social responsibility. So actually with my paper, what I looked at was the 100 best companies to work for in America. And that's a really good data set because what you have is an independent body surveying 250 employees at all levels and finding out what is it in terms of working for this company. So that data actually was really easy to gather. It's really publicly available. And those 4 years was not actually getting the data. It was just analyzing that data really carefully and distinguishing correlation from causation. But right now we have a lot of great data sets for ESG. I think actually we have sometimes the wrong problem, which is people put too much of a faith in data. So certainly, as you say, Kate, I'm a finance person. I understand the importance of data.
Right.
But we also need to recognize that data doesn't show you everything. So let's think about diversity and inclusion. Well, you could have data on the percentage of women or minorities on the board or the workforce, but that doesn't really say anything about the culture of a company. So what we need is not just data, but qualitative assessment. So there are ways that people are trying to figure out what is it like to work for a company on a qualitative basis. This might be interviewing senior management on what do you do to make their employees feel valued, perhaps finding out what employees say themselves. So there's websites like Glassdoor where employees will report what it is like to work for the company. So I think it's the combination of the quantitative and the qualitative, which is really powerful.
Right. I think that's also a gradual process for senior managements and policymakers. They can understand how to measure it from both qualitative and quantitative side and can make this thing work. In your book, you also mentioned this sentence: ESG is only recently becoming mainstream, but it is also very important, especially in those big responsible firms, in order to make this pie bigger. But how do you think investors will look at it, especially in difficult times, especially in times of crisis like nowadays, where we are facing pandemic, we are facing regional military conflict? Is this thing still a priority?
Yeah, that's a really good question because people feared when the pandemic hit that people will just not think about ESG. They think it's a luxury where in good times you can think about it, but in bad times you should just focus on profit. Right. But because the data that I had, it spanned 28 years, it included the financial crisis, it included September the 11th and the collapse of the internet bubble. So it included past crises times, and it showed that actually responsibility particularly pays off in those difficult times. Why it's in the difficult times that really customer loyalty is really important. And so a company with a strong purpose, that's one where actually your customers, your workers, your suppliers will stay with you. Also, what's interesting about my approach to responsibility, it's about growing the pie, not splitting the pie. So if purpose is about splitting the cake, giving lots of money to charity, that is indeed unrealistic in a pandemic. There's not much money to give. But if you think of what have many companies done in terms of the pandemic, it's been a lot of innovative stuff. So you might take an alcohol company who then uses their facilities to make hand sanitizer. And that's something which it doesn't really cost you a lot of money. It's just about the mindset of using your comparative advantage and reorienting that to serve wider society.
I still think it's a luxury. For instance, the military conflict, the regional military conflict has already causing fossil fuel price increase. It has already caused more or less a reverse of the green transmission, process. Don't you think this ESG investment won't get affected at all?
Well, so certainly the priorities that a company has or the world has will change over time. So right now, you might think, well, it could be the military situation is really important, or you might think that it's the global pandemic is really important. Obviously, attempts to solve the pandemic, let's say flying N95 masks, that's going to be something with a carbon footprint. So I think what we always need to think about is addressing the world's problems. Now, those world problems will change over time. And indeed, it may be that right now, the climate crisis, which is an important long-term problem, is actually not the most important thing right now in terms of society. So I think companies should not be sort of dogmatic about what the social goals are, but be willing to be nimble and realize that right now the military conflicts or the pandemic might be even more important than something like climate, even though climate is certainly the most important thing over the next sort of 40 years or so.
Right, fair enough. You have 3 points that I want to ask you. I think they're indeed very interesting, but might be a little bit controversial. First of all, you mentioned reducing CEO salaries isn't actually the most effective way to reform pay to benefit society. I'm not sure, shareholders will be extremely happy to hear that. And the second one is investors selling his shares in the short term can encourage businesses to act more longer term, which makes sense, especially when market tumbles. But I'm not sure the company founder will hear it. When they hear it, they will be very happy. And third one, a company using cash to buy back shares rather than investing it may create long-run value, not just for its shareholders, but also for the economy as a whole. That's only when they have nothing else to invest. So can you just tell us your rationale very briefly on these 3 points?
Absolutely, and you're right to say, Kate, these are quite controversial points, but I think these are points where I actually have a quite different view when you have the idea that the cake is not fixed. The cake can be grown. So let's start with CEO pay. So often people think that if I want to create more value for shareholders, let me pay the CEO as little as possible, because the less there is for the CEO, there's more there is for shareholders. But in fact, when you're incentivizing the CEO, she grows the pie, she's actually creating a lot of value, and the amount of value that she creates is far greater than the pay that you give her. So let's say in the US, for example, the companies are $20 billion. If they increase firm value by just 1%, that's $200 million. That's so many times more than her pay. The second point was about selling shares. So often people think as a great investor, you should never sell your shares, you should always be loyal. But in fact, one of the most powerful devices is to hold companies to account. So if a company is not investing in its workforce, it's not improving its D&I, it's not reducing its carbon emissions, you should sell those companies as a shareholder. You don't want to be always loyal. And the final thing that you mentioned, Kate, is the idea of share buybacks. Now, people say, well, if you're buying back shares, then you're not investing. But actually, a company should not be investing in everything. Right? As I mentioned, you should only be investing where you have comparative advantage and the issue is material. If indeed you've taken all of those great investment opportunities, I think the good thing to do is to show restraint, to give that money back to shareholders, and they can use that money to finance some startup companies. And so that's actually something which is good for the economy.
Right, great. I think that's very insightful. My last question to you, and I think it's very important one before I let you go, is I think, to reduce inequality is probably something very important in our age. How do you think this ESG investment can help us reduce this inequality, on this planet? If there's any roadblock, what are they? Or if there's, any very positive side, what are those, optimistic side that we can count on ESG investment?
Yeah, so I'd actually say the main roadblock to reducing inequality is the fixed pie mindset. So when you think the cake is fixed, then the only way that a company can reduce inequality is by giving money to charity or increasing wages. Now, that is not a bad thing, but I say the best thing a company can do to reduce inequality is to grow the cake through innovation. For example, as I mentioned, Vodafone launching M-Pesa, that lifted 200,000 households out of poverty. Let's take a Chinese firm. So My Bank, China's first digital bank, what they're trying to do is they're tracking the number of loans that they give to small and micro companies who'd never received business loans before. Now, that's not about paying the CEO less. That's not about paying workers more, but that's about innovating. That's about giving financial resources so that other companies can grow. And so I think this cake growing mindset is really important. It's not just about splitting the cake.
Right. Before I let you go, I still want to ask you about this Milton Friedman argument that you touched upon in your book. I think it's also very important because that's associated with stakeholders benefit instead of shareholders. Would you please explain to us a little bit?
Yeah, so Milton Friedman in 1970 famously said, the social responsibility of business is to increase profits. All a company should do is focus on increasing profits. And that's really controversial because people think, well, if you increase profits, the only way you can do that is by mistreating your workers or polluting the environment. And so that's why they say profits are a bad thing, capitalism is evil. But actually, if you read the article, it's much more nuanced than one might think. So he said a company should increase long-term profits, with the emphasis being on the long term. Because the only way that you can increase your profits in the long term is if you invest in your workers, is if you treat customers well, is if you reduce your environmental footprint or your brand will be hurt. So what I want to reset is the idea that profits are a bad thing. Actually, it can be the case that you are a profitable company, but the reason why you're profitable is you are creating a lot of value for society. So again, it's not profit or purpose, it's a win-win, it's both and, the cake can be grown.
Right, so to make the pie bigger is probably the ultimate goal, and it is probably the most crucial point. In your book, I particularly like a couple of sentences, and I picked out, I'll read them out, if I may. The first one is, why do people invest in a company? To provide for their own or their children's future. This is one particular sentence I like a lot. And then the second one is stakeholder capitalism. The idea that business should serve wider society has become the corporate buzzword of the day. Purpose of corporation includes stakeholders rather than only shareholders. So Alex, thank you very much for your time. Is there anything that you want to say to Chinese audiences, because your Chinese version of this book is launching?
Yes, I'd first say I'm delighted that it was published in China. And why do I think this is so important around the world? Is that I think for far too long, people have thought about purpose and responsibility as being fluffy, as a luxury that we should cut back in times of crisis. But I'm coming to this as a hard-hearted business person with the knowledge of the importance that finance and shareholder returns are key. But what I want to stress is it's not either or. In fact, if you are a more purposeful company, not only is it good for society, it's also good for shareholders and long-term profits. So this is something I think every company should adopt. And again, it's not based on wishful thinking, but a lot of evidence plus a framework to put it into practice.
Great. That's definitely very insightful. We should all be responsible of what we are doing and then grow the pie bigger together. So thank you very much, Alex, for your time. And this is your new book in Chinese, and we look forward to its launching on Chinese market. Thank you very much. That's Alex Edmans joining us from London. Thank you.